name's Ollie Lawton. I'm a GP in Leamington, and I'm a clinical director for North Leamington Primary Care Network, which basically gives me a bit of an overview role to have some responsibility for population health in Leamington. My task tonight is to talk about the effects of climate change on health. It's a huge topic. This is very brief, and I'm obviously completely blind to who's in the audience, so there might be climate change lecturers out there, so I apologise if I'm teaching any of you to suck eggs. So yeah, just to go through really what we like in when we're at medical school, we learn lots of mnemonics to help us go through all of these lists that we have to remember. And a mnemonic for remembering the effects of climate change on health is heat wave, which is a pretty neat way. And I'm just going to talk you through those, if that's all right, as a way of reminding you. So the first thing, the H is for heat illness. So it's the most kind of direct one. I've got some slides which I'll hopefully be able to work out how to share if we do split out into the groups. Heat illness is a really direct one. So put simply, temperature goes up, that will mean we'll have more days of extreme heat. That leads to people having sunstroke, dehydration. We see increased hospital admissions throughout that time, and a burden directly of just these extreme heat days, which we sometimes see already. Those numbers will go up, and there's some modelling of what those numbers will look like in a few years' time. There's also indirect effects of rising temperatures and these extreme heat days. It kills crops in other countries that are very dependent. That causes famine, that causes poverty, that causes environmental refugees, and huge effects on population health as well. So just the direct effect of heat going up will cause a lot of illness. Now, the E in heat wave mnemonic is for exacerbations of heart and lung disease. So that basically means worsening of people's disease. We're seeing a lot of that, and you've probably heard about it in COVID times. People with underlying diseases get more poorly when we have climate change, and the estimated figures are that every year 7 million people currently die because of air pollution. I've got a little graph that I can share later just to show those numbers for Warwickshire. But for example, we think we see about 149 extra deaths per 10,000 just due to air pollution in Warwickshire alone. So they're big things. If you imagine 7 million extra deaths a year, at the moment COVID's up to 1.4 million deaths, and I think it'll probably stop at around 2 million deaths. If you were sat in a meeting like this 20, 30 years ago and someone said to you, there's going to be this thing called COVID in 2020, it's going to cause millions of people to die, would you like to do something about it? We'd probably be all quite convinced to look at it as a topic, wouldn't we? The next thing is directly asthma. So loads of studies into whether and how asthma increases it. It's a simple thing. Asthma gets worse when there's air pollutions and particles in the air. You probably already know that one, but just to give you some scale of it, it's probably about 5.4 million people in the UK with asthma. That will go up huge amounts if pollution levels continue to rise. I'm missing my slides a little bit here, but the next one for the T is trauma. So we know that if climate change carries on, there will be more hurricanes and floods, as we know that. And unfortunately, people suffer trauma and injury during those two events, which is pretty obvious, but something we maybe don't bear in mind. So on the T, we're moving to the W of heat wave.
2 minutes left, Oliver. Sorry.
That's great. And the W stands for water and foodborne illnesses. So that's really where the numbers start ramping up. So we know, because I know somebody's talking about flooding, but when we get more flooding, we get something called combined sewage overflow. That means our sewage mixes with our sanitized water, and we get diseases like E. coli, hepatitis. We will see cases of things like cholera coming back to the UK if that is allowed to happen, which is pretty scary stuff. Next one is A for allergies, an obvious one. Hotter, longer summers mean more hay fever. 45,000 GP appointments per month about hay fever in the summer. So if you're frustrated you can't see your GP now because there aren't enough of us, it's only going to get worse, I'm afraid. And then the big one is the V, which stands for vector-borne disease, which is a fancy way of saying vectors are insects. So we talk about malaria, and let's not forget things like Zika virus that actually happened 4 years ago. Those types of diseases are more prevalent in warmer climes because insects are cold-blooded, so they reproduce and replicate more in warmer temperatures. Just think of Stratford butterfly farm. And when you've got more of those insects, you've got more chance of spreading these diseases, and they will become more prevalent in our nations, no doubt, and we're protected from that with our colder climate. The last one is the E, is emotional stress, which is a huge burden. As a GP, 1 in 4 of my consultations are about people with a mental health problem. That will get a huge amount worse when we have stresses. We're seeing that with the pandemic at the moment. And you know, things like famine, poverty, less jobs, it's going to make it worse. So that's the heat wave mnemonic. Very happy to answer any questions. The last thing I'd just like to say in my last couple of seconds is to flip this around. So don't just think about the direct effects of pollution being in the air or floods. They're very important things, but they're quite hard to imagine because they're not happening to us every day. Flip it round and say, often when humans aren't doing things that create emissions, driving to work being a big example, we're often doing things that are much healthier. So if we have provision for cycle paths and it's safer to cycle your kids to nursery, you're not only reducing the emissions and all the things I've talked about, you're also increasing your activity levels. And for me as a GP, that's how I got interested in this, in that there's loads of studies and data I can share with you. Just getting people to cycle to work once a week hugely increases their life expectancy, cancer risk, dementia, all sorts of things, which aren't things to be sneered at really. So yeah, as I say, feel free to ask any questions afterwards, and it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour.
5 or 6 minutes to talk about flooding. The starting point, I suppose, is the fact that when we have warmer sea surface temperatures, when we have warmer atmosphere, that means that more water can evaporate from the ocean itself. So we've seen that this year with the increasing number of hurricanes within the Atlantic itself. What we also see is with more water in the atmosphere, this also means that basically we get more rainfall. So when we look at climate change, when we look at what is happening at the moment, what we're seeing is the UK climate has got wetter. It's not a case of it will be, it is already getting wetter. If we look at rainfall over a 5-day period, it's now 4% more rain than it was between 1961 and 1990. If we look at winters, these are getting wetter. They're now about 5% wetter compared to the period from 1981 to 2010, and 12% wetter if we go back to 1961. So things are getting wetter. Summers are also getting wetter. So they're now roughly about 10% wetter than they were before. But this is not evenly distributed over the season. This is one of the problems when it comes to flooding. If we look at very wet days, so when it really buckets down with rain, the number of these exceptionally wet days has gone up by almost 20%. So we're seeing the first signs of climate change today, and this is already having a big impact on our environment, our built environment, our living environment. To put it into context, within the UK, there are well over 2 million properties that are already at risk from flooding. So that's today. We're not looking at what might happen in the future. That is the situation today. What we've also got to consider, and it's quite nice that Oliver was talking about some of these things, is the impact of flooding. When a property gets flooded, not all of those households will be able to return to their property in a short space of time. Typically, in any area where flooding has taken place, over 10% of those households will remain out of their property for over a year. And again, this has significant impacts on things like mental health. Not only that, those impacts will continue not just for a couple of days, a couple of weeks. These will go on for months, potentially even years after the event. So flooding is a very long-term issue. It is something that needs to be resolved. But the risk of flooding is growing, not just in terms of what we're doing at the moment, but will also increase in the future. As far as the future climate is concerned, so certainly by 2050, 2100, we are looking at the climate models agreeing in the fact that we will get wetter winters, so wetter winters than we have at the moment, and drier summers. But that doesn't mean no flooding in the summers. The risk of flash floods, very high intense, short duration rainfall leading to significant flooding in the summer months is likely to increase, similar to what happened in Warwick in August with the very heavy storms that occurred. So there are lots of issues there. Now, as far as flooding is concerned, it is quite complicated because we have river flooding, rivers spilling their banks. We've got coastal flooding. You only need to think about where all our ports are, how we get food into our countries. These are low-lying areas of the coast. We have
Chris, I'm just going to chip in with the 2-minute warning.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Got surface water flooding, and that's basically where water does not actually reach the watercourses. And we've got groundwater flooding, basically the water table rising up through the ground itself. And we won't go into sewer flooding, but I'm sure you can imagine what that actually involves. So as far as flooding is concerned, it has a significant impact. If we consider Mexico, the state of Tabasco, 2007 flooded, 2/3 of the state ended up underwater. That destroyed 30% of that state's GDP. Also, one other thing to think about, in Bangkok, again, flooding occurred there. Bangkok, a long way away, other side of the planet, and yet it had a big impact on global supply chains. When we look at what goes on in the developing world, the situation...
What's a global supply chain, Chris? What's a global supply chain?
Basically, the global supply chain is everything we buy, everything we purchase, usually is having to be imported. We get a lot of goods being brought in from overseas. The food we eat, the food we buy in supermarkets, a lot of that is imported from other countries. And that is what is going to be severely affected. So flooding is very problematic. I've just been able to touch the very tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid.